Well, nearly every current aquaculture facility in the state discharge effluents into tributaries that flow into the Great Lakes. State hatcheries, public hatcheries, private hatcheries, nearly every single one of them do at this point. In 2014, Michigan DNR stocked over 20 million fish from gametes collected from the wild. This equated to more than 325 tons of fish stocked, 9 different species, and 370 stocking trips to 732 stocking sites from several different hatcheries. In comparison, net pen operations typically stock a single cohort of certified specific pathogen-free fish, raise the fish to harvest, and truck the fish to slaughter facility. Both public and private hatcheries are held to the same regulatory standards in terms of health and invasive species. It seems reasonable then that net pen aquaculture could have greater control and risk management than public aquaculture facilities in terms of disease and invasive species. Now, I'm not pointing the finger at the state system because I think they have one of the finest in the world. They have very good biosecurity programs. What I'm doing is just comparing the potential between the two. Also, when talking about tourism, I think it's important to ask, could a net pen hatchery, could that really hurt tourism? Or could it also help tourism or not? I mean, if I was a tourist and I was up, let's go see the net pen. I think that is a possibility. In terms of charter fishing, fishing on charter boats, according to the economic report, fishing on charter boats is also an important activity in the Great Lakes, with charter trips averaging 17,000 per year, 1990 to 2009, with a declining trend over time. The severity of the declining trend for Lake Huron salmon charter fishing is not provided. Also importantly, potential benefits of net pen aquaculture and aquatic ecosystems and fishing should be considered. So I went and took the time to graph out the Lake Huron charter boat harvest, and I'll show this, and I'll also put it on the back table when I'm done speaking here. But 2014 Lake Huron charter boat harvest was 22,631 fish. And in 2014, it's down to 4,779. So if you take a look at that, we have a serious collapse of the salmon fishery in like at least a charter boat harvest. Now, according to the NOAA report, studies have shown that excess food and waste released from fish cages may be a food source for wild fish, especially benthic feeders. Cages may also provide shelter and forage habitat for fish. These characteristics may be considered a benefit to the local and regional environment because of increased production of local fish and potential benefits to the benthic environment. Based on the status of the Lake Huron fishery and changing dynamics impacting prey availability within the Great Lakes, this could be an important area for research. Also, according to the science report, page 20, third paragraph, interaction between anglers and aquaculture operations in Canada waters is generally seen as a positive for both the aquaculture industry and the recreational angler. An interesting point brought forward by Dr. Lupi is that the price analysis used a cost of $2.75, which falls between, say, $1.63, which is a national average, and $3.39 a pound in Michigan. My guess is that Michigan wholesalers probably get in the range from $2.75 to $3.25 a pound. Now, what about indoor systems? This is something in my position that I struggle with all the time. Reason being, well, we really don't know what, we're still waiting to see someone successfully using indoor systems, which is recirculating aquaculture systems. We're still waiting to see someone being able to be successful other than tilapia for the live Asian market. Tilapia for the live Asian market is a premium market. It's a niche market. It costs us twice the amount to grow fillets and tilapia in indoor systems than we can import from South America. We do know the RAS systems require 2 to 3 times initial capital cost to construct and have substantially higher fixed costs to operate than net pens. My guess is that rainbow trout from RAS would be about 2 to 3 times more than net pen facilities, which likely move them out of the local grocery stores and into the high-end markets and restaurants. The Aquaculture, the report, Aquaculture industry report, talking about the economics, authors noted they were unable to find estimates of market size for individual species of fish and seafood, and therefore used data from the 2013 USDA Aquaculture Census. And this might get back to a question before we even started. What happened is in this, the authors did not look at what the trends are going on right now. So I spent a lot of time with that 2013 census. And I plotted here, this is from the census for trout in 2013 and 2005. We see in 2005, we had, between 2005 and 2013, there was a 5% reduction in volume in trout per action in the nation. At the same time, there's a 50% rise in value in cost per pound for trout. So what we see is something really, really serious might be going on. I also spent a lot of time looking at seafood deficits. This figure shows the U.S. seafood deficit from 2003 to 2014. This, the 2014 value recently came out. There was a $2 billion increase in the U.S. seafood deficit in the last year. That is the biggest deficit ever. So there are some certain real serious trends going on, and we've heard about the demand for seafood and everything else. So I think we need to keep that picture in mind. In terms of the legal report, it describes MDQ responsibilities under NREPA for public trust in waters, and the Department of Environmental Quality, if found not to be impaired or substantially affected, may enter into lease agreements pertaining to submerged lands. The legal report describes protection by the NPDES permit requirement under the Federal Clean Water Act and NREPA, and it describes U.S. EPA guidelines for concentrated farming facilities and requires best management practices, which also goes into NPDES permits. It is my opinion that NREPA and the Clean Water Act are part of a comprehensive and effective regulatory framework already established in Michigan. Current laws and regulations allow for public use of resources, including fish production, fisheries, marinas, etc., under permitting and monitoring as necessary by the state. In addition, there are existing regulations for water monitoring and requirements in Ontario, Maine, and Washington for net pen facilities, which provide an excellent opportunity to fit in the Michigan framework. In terms of the science report, I concur with the report's findings. An adaptive management program approach as outlined is the best correct pathway for net pen development, regardless of where it occurs. Some caution may be warranted in setting pathways unnecessarily high as to remove economic incentive, which is part of the sustainability concept. Invasive species. Risk of invasive species to net pen production is limited primarily to accidental movement through gear and water. That's indicated on page 18 of the report. Possibilities exist for non-native species introduction and spread from activities such as transport of fry from hatcheries and routine movement. So biosecurity plans should be included, and as I mentioned, both public and private hatcheries are held to the same regulatory standards. Escapes. Escapes are a concern. However, risk is reduced and minimized to establish the best management practices, your stock selection, and your site selection. Also technology. Disease. The state of Michigan has probably one of the finest aquatic diagnostic programs for freshwater species in the country. And the state of Michigan has exceptional expertise in fish production and aquatic disease across public agencies, workforce, and academic institutions. Lake Superior State is geographically well located and positioned for support and training for diagnostics, monitoring, research, and development. Regulations and management practices require fish health inspections and certified specific pathogen-free stocks. And Ontario has been operating since 1982 And we really haven't seen any disease issues with them. So if there were disease issues for the last 30 years, at least our managers would be aware of that. Nutrients. Net pen fish production is a farming activity, but we do know a lot about the chemical composition of fish species, specifically rainbow trout, fed commercial diet. So there is a lot of data out there. And to get back to one of the earlier questions about monitoring, I think typically the NPDES permits require, they base it on mass balance calculations. So they know what goes in. Well, that's what scientists do. They take everything that's convoluted, they take a mass balance, but what they do is they limit the amount of feed that they can feed in a year. And then they give all monitoring parameters around that as well. So a recent trend in food production receiving much attention is aquaponics, which combines fish culture with hydroponics to grow fish and plants for human consumption. The waste produced by the fish becomes a nutrient source for the plants. Usually the plants grown in these systems are leafy vegetables with low nutrient requirements such as lettuce and watercress. Similar to RAS aquaculture, aquaponics is shown not economically viable in our region beyond niche scale. Where I'm going with this is that permitting requirements and standards for allowable total maximum daily, no, I skipped over here. Fish waste can be basically as a dilute fertilizer. That's what we can look at fish waste as. It also differs from human and terrestrial animal waste because it is absent of harmful bacteria such as E. coli and salmonella. Page 20, the report talks about regulations stating, quote, current state and federal regulations, as well as the provisions of the 2012 Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, provide regulators with both the mandate and tools for appropriate regulation. So I'm just about finished here, but I'm calling this short section opportunity with a question mark. It is well known that rising global demand for seafood aquaculture will become increasingly more important in the future. However, for aquaculture to expand, it has to do so in an environmentally conserving, socially and culturally serving, and economically viable manner. So the question that we have at hand then is whether net pen aquaculture in the Great Lakes can be considered sustainable. Based on the assessments commissioned of the state of Michigan, I believe that through an adaptive management process outlined in the science report, the opportunity indeed exists to explore how the Great Lakes could be managed effectively in a way that allows for some capacity of net pen aquaculture, and moreover, such an endeavor could benefit local fisheries in the process. It's all about siting. From an ecological standpoint, 1 to 2 pilot commercial scale net pen systems would provide opportunity to assess impacts, both positive and negative, on local biodiversity. They would also yield important information regarding private, public, and tribal partnership opportunities, human health, and seafood value chain development. Both the science and regulation reports show that regulations are in place to minimize potential risk and ensure no long-term negative impacts. You know, obviously the use of public resources for aquaculture appears to be one of the major issues, and Dr. Lupi in his report identified a number of potential user conflicts. While much more discussion about this is going to continue, I thought it'd be helpful to kind of give you a pictorial view.
Dr. Weeds, and in the interest of time, since we've been...
Yep, I'm finished right now.
Thank you very much.
What I want to do is have this diagram.
If, any of the diagrams, if you'd like to provide them to us, we'll include them in our final report.
What I've done is taken a scale of one of the pilot hatcheries, and I put it up with the marina in St. Joe Harbor, and you can see a relative scale of what this pilot study would be talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Jim DeClerc.
My name is Jim DeClerc, and I am associated with Saginaw Field Stream Club, Missionary Resort Stewards, MUCC, and I sit on the Lake Huron Citizens Fisheries Advisory Council. My forte is in the financial side of the house. In business case studies, I have done business case studies for various projects all over the world. So I consider myself a little bit of an expert in them. Anyway, business case study, you ask yourself, why do you need it? You need it to find out if you're going to make a profit. You need to find out the kind of investment you need to start and to sustain it. You need it to find out how long you might be in business. Now, you need to be very conservative with a business case study. You need to be kind of conservative on how much money you're going to take in, maybe a little high on how much your expenses are. That's being conservative with the numbers. Now, if I was in business, had a client come to me and say, will you do a business case study based upon the information that was provided and based upon the presentation of today, and I went through this, I would tell my client to forget it. Don't even do a business case study because you're wasting your time. And the reason I would tell them that to start with is because the assumptions made in these studies are not what I would call reasonable. They are not realistic. And the study does not really offer anything. The market demand has been described in a couple of different places here today. But if the demand was there, the demand would have been filled. So I can't believe there is that great a demand. The numbers that are kicked around are things that maybe we could do, maybe it's out there, maybe it isn't. Maybe we should be eating twice as much fish. If we were supposed to be eating twice as much fish, you could walk across the lakes on boats to be able to get the fish, all right? So it's hard for me to believe. The selling prices that were kicked around, or what the values were of these things, are also something that are highly questionable to me. There is no infrastructure to be able to support this activity. There are unknown costs, and there are undefined requirements that are laid out in this thing, very much so. So I would say to my client, there is a significant problem where your business could be wiped out overnight. The studies briefly talk about wind. One or two of them mention ice. None of them mention wind and ice together. And that can happen overnight. And if anybody doesn't want to believe that, you can talk to the people in Bay City back here a few years ago. They got a northeaster came through there and put ice in their houses, 100 yards up the beach. There is no safe place in the Great Lakes. A good wind coming from some direction can bury anything. So that's another danger that would be coming in. I would tell my client that you don't want to be first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, or 10th in this business. And if you happen to be the 10th one, you're probably going to be the first one because the other 9 are going to roll over by the time the whole thing gets put together. The business cases in this instance do not support, leastwise the information that's been presented, do not support someone who's going to invest some money into this business. And in closing, if you want to know what the environmental impact is going to be on one of these cages, try raising pigs in your backyard.
Thank you. Next is Thomas Herder.
Okay, I got nothing there.
Thank you. Next is Louis Hamper.
Good afternoon. My name is Louis Hamper. 35 years in aquaculture business in the United States, Mexico, South America, and Africa. Also a resident of Michigan, born in Greenville. First thing I'd like to say is thank you to the Quality of Life team for their work on the report, and thanks to the scientific committee for taking the time and donating their time, their energy, and their work to supply us with a science-based document to help us guide the process of net pen aquaculture in the state of Michigan. With that said, and also, I mean, it's probably pretty obvious to everybody, I am a supporter of net pen aquaculture in Michigan, and I'm a supporter of aquaculture in general. I know the industry in the years that it's been in existence, or in the recent history, I should say, in the last 30, 40 years, has received a whole lot of black eyes. And I've seen them. And I've also seen the responsible actions of how the industry has dealt with these black eyes and moved forward in a sustainable and equal-friendly manner. And I see the same thing in the net pen industry also. Not just recirculating, not just pond culture, but also in the net pen industry. I'm going to just make a few comments here about best management practices, because there's, like Dr. Weeks touched base on, there's a lot of questions out there of, well, how do you deal with escapement? How do you deal with nutrient loading, and how do you deal with all this stuff? And these are issues that are constantly at the forefront of the aquaculturist and the manner in which they operate the facilities. And we're constantly looking at and using best management practices concerning the size of mesh that we use to contain the animals in the nets. We're constantly looking at what size of animal do we stock in those nets to make sure that they don't escape. We're constantly looking at the health of the animals to ensure that they don't become diseased and don't have mitigate the possibility of disease being transferred into the natural population. We're constantly looking at, when can we handle those fish? To stress them so they are stressed the least possible, and therefore have the least possible chance of becoming diseased. These are just a few, and there's a whole lot more. And I'm not going to sit here and go into all of them, but there's a huge amount of best management practices that have brought this industry to a sustainable place today. And just in addition to that, there's discussions, a little bit of information going on more on a global level, and just a couple comments and comparisons. And we all eat cattle. Nobody ever, thinks of cattle as, there's very few comments about the impact of cattle on our ecosystem. But for every kilo of edible beef, there's 40 kilos of CO2 emitted into the environment. That's carbon footprint. Okay? For fish, is 3 kilos. Okay, so there's a lot of benefits to growing fish. It takes 15,000 liters of water to produce 1 kilo of beef. That equates to, I've been overseas so many years, but I'm using metric, but that's 2,000 gallons per pound. And that's water that goes to producing crops, producing corn, so on and so forth. 10% of that water is needed for fish. It's a huge opportunity. Has to be done right. Aquaculture knows that it has to be done right, or it won't exist. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Next, Jon Walters.
Thank you. My name is Jon Walters. I'm the state chairman for Michigan Trout Unlimited, and I'd like to thank the audience for their patience. I'm often asked, why are we involved in net penning in the Great Lakes from the standpoint of Trout Unlimited? And I think our mission pretty eloquently states that we are to conserve, protect, and restore Michigan watersheds that support wild trout and salmon. Great Lakes is the greatest watershed in our Great Lakes system, so of course we're going to be involved. I would suggest that Michigan has the finest fisheries in the country, including smallmouth bass, walleyes. I just got a DNR report on Friday suggesting that the coho salmon are making great strides for improvement. And with the crash of Chinook salmon, the steelhead are looked at very highly from a wild sports fishery. As Jim Olson recently stated, this is a legal debate and argument. I think he did a very nice job at reporting what we need to consider and look at. The science panel, though they did a great job at reporting their findings, I think they were charged with the wrong question. Instead of how to make this happen, which I think they did a good job at referencing how Michigan can make aquaculture happen, I think they really should have been charged with, if we do this, then what? Then what is the economic negative impacts to Michigan, that being fishing, as you've heard, boating, recreation, and tourism. I think Gary Merrick also stated very eloquently today that Alaska does not allow this because it's too important. I think Gary fell a little bit short to suggest Michigan is way too important for this to happen. 2 weeks ago, I heard on the radio that Bill Creel from the DEQ is putting together a Lake Erie cleanup for phosphorus, and that is coming from the Detroit River water system. It has no logical sense to me, if we're cleaning up human waste from Lake Erie, that we're going to put in additional phosphorus into Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, and potentially other Great Lakes throughout the region. We certainly agree with Senator Jones and his aquaculture bill to ban aquaculture in the net penning aspect, and no, we did not have anything to do with its language. We would encourage the state of Michigan to ban net penning and encourage other states in the Great Lakes region to ban that as well, and to ask Canada to stop that net penning activity. Finally, Michigan's too important to flush fish excrement, phosphorus, antibiotics, and steroids down the toilet, and having our Great Lakes as the toilet.
Thank you. Next is Frank Christ.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm Frank Christ. I'm here representing the Hammond Bay Anglers. I had a chance to review all the 5 reports along with a lot of other information, mostly journal articles. I will say Hannah has a copy of my report, and I'm also going to be sending another one to the DNR, the final report. And I do have links to all the references. They're not all old and so forth, so you can also take a look at them if you want. After looking at all that information, I believe the most important concern would be disease. A panel put forward a protocol and basically monitoring, reporting, prevention like biosecurity, best practices, control, vaccines, drugs, biologics, things like that, and then eventually eradication. One thing I was rather surprised is they didn't really take a look at that in relation to cage systems. This I can see would work for closed systems, and there's an excellent example and that's the Norway region. They produce annual reports on their fish health. They've been in operation for over 30 years. They have strict protocols, very strict protocols. They have, like I said, many years of experience, and in spite of that, 10, 15, 20% of their production is lost to disease every year. They list many, many diseases, probably close to a dozen that they have to deal with. And they have tried to deal with it. Of course, as all of you know, the disease is spread by urine, feces, other body fluids, and they tried moving their cages deeper. They are tending towards 150 to up to 1,000 feet. They're moving them where there's heavier tides. And I noticed in the regulatory report the state put out is that Maine, in their regulations, only will allow cages if there's an area that has a very significant tide. Well, the Great Lakes only have a ½ inch to maybe 2 inches and really doesn't have any impact. And another study was showing that a lot of people think this waste and disease is just deposited around the cage, but it did show that organisms can travel long distances with the currents. So obviously in the Great Lakes, we would not have anywhere near the flushing, and yet with all that extra emphasis, they have major problems. Another area that hasn't been touched on today, and I think it's really significant, is mutations. When you put a lot of animals like fish together, there's a chance for these disease organisms to mutate. And if you look at, just for a couple examples quickly, VHS in the Great Lakes, the form that's in the Great Lakes now, actually, most scientists think, has mutated from the European strain that was a saltwater strain. In addition, probably the disease that's caused the most problems, devastated some of the industries around the world, is infectious salmon anemia. That virus normally in the environment is rather benign. It has mutated several times. There's a new report that just came out the fall of last year. They're looking at that virus in Chile, and what they found, it's continuing to mutate, and it's still very virulent. Some of the strains are not, or let's say they're benign. So that's a serious concern. One thing that the industry is doing is they're breeding their fish to be disease resistant. Makes a lot of sense. And the problem is you have these fish, they do good biosecurity, they're clean in the hatchery, but they pick up organisms in the environment. That's why the biosecurity doesn't work. So they're more resistant. They could actually have a disease, not die, shed the organisms to the water, and then the wild fish coming by could be more susceptible. So that's a real concern. So the question really is, do these disease problems at these big facilities like in Norway cause problems to the wild population? There's been a worldwide global assessment, and they looked at areas where there's a lot of production, cage production, and also nearby rivers that had wild population. They also looked at controlled rivers that were much further away from the cage operations. And what they found is that in many areas, as the cage production went up, the wild population numbers went down. Right now, I agree it's a controversy. There's a big controversy in British Columbia. There's people on both sides seem to be presenting evidence that maybe the same disease, infectious salmon anemia, may be infecting species other than Atlantic salmon. Another thing to keep in mind with all the food web changes going on in the Great Lakes, forage numbers fluctuating, there could be more stress. So the fish, the wild fish, could be in a position to pick up the disease much easier. Real quickly, I have a couple other points I wanted to mention is that if you look at the facilities in Ontario, aerial photos, what you'll see is land or shallow reefs around them. Rarely does the wind have to blow, a chance to blow more than 5, 10, maybe in most extreme cases, 20 miles. I've lived up in Rogers City, Northeast Michigan for 41 years, familiar with the coast. And all those years, there's never been one day where I would really get out there and walk on the ice. It constantly moves. Even in Thunder Bay, where you might see ice this week, I'll go shopping next week, and it's gone. Another thing is the waves. You compare it to Ontario, the waves over there are rough, like I said, they're surrounded by land. Rogers City thought they were smart. They hired some engineers, they built and expanded their harbor in 1995, and when you look out there with that expansion, you couldn't quite see the lake. The engineer said, no problem. First big wind we had out of the east, the launching docks were up on the parking lot, the docks in the harbor were all damaged. They had to come back, put an extension around. The reason that we have rocks, breakwalls, is because the lake is brutal. When I was up in St. Ignace at the aquaculture meeting, and it was excellent, one of the producers from Ontario, he mentioned after I brought up the fact that there's interest in putting a lot of cages on our side, he said, look at the conditions. You'd be lucky in Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, to have 2 or 3 or 4 spots where it'd be suitable. Finally, I want to talk about benthification of Lake Huron. Jim Johnson mentioned that a little bit, a couple other speakers. With the quagga mussels, what's happening is that the mussels are filling the water and pulling the food to the bottom. And this is real interesting. I know you can't see this very well, but this is a reef off of Alpena. And this is Jim's photo. I stole it from him. And you can see it's covered with Cladophora. Now this photo here is what it looks like when the wind washes it up on the shore. And I have first-hand experience with this, and the reason is I worked for the health department up in Pascal County for 34 years, starting in 1974. Never had any complaints about this, what we call Cladophora muck, along the shore. But starting in 2005, we got a lot of calls from Hammer Bay, and also even Rogers City, and at the same time, Jim was experiencing that down in Thunder Bay. And what it is, it's Cladophora, chara, and other debris that washes up on shore from this situation where the mussels are concentrating most of the energy that used to be in the water columns on the bottom. And the question is, as I mentioned, the chances are we're going to have the cages placed in a very few areas, like Grand Traverse Bay, maybe Bay de Knox, and that means if it does go through, you're going to have a lot of enrichment, and hopefully you're not going to have a big mess like I just showed you. Keep in mind that Hammond Bay, where we see this, is extremely low illegal traffic. Naturally, there's not much productivity in the area, and if you added a lot more, I'm afraid that you're gonna have a big expansion. One thing to keep in mind is that we keep talking about Ontario. You can't talk about Ontario. I kind of disagree with Dr. Weeks a little bit. He mentioned $1 billion, and that's pounds. Originally, they talked about going from 5 million pounds to £1 billion, 200 times in 10 years. The thing is that if you really think about it, if they weren't interested in doing that, why did they put it in there? At the very least, they're thinking about expanding it greatly. There's only, like Dr. Weeks said, 17 million pounds being produced there. You gotta look at facilities like Norway, that's got a lot of experience and are producing a lot of fish each year. Thanks a lot for the opportunity.
Thank you. Next is Rick Leeson.
Good afternoon. My name is Rick Gleason. I represent the Michigan Farm Bureau. Michigan Farm Bureau is an independent, non-governmental, voluntary organization governed by and representing farmer and rancher family members. Aquaculture and commercial fishing are major contributions to our Michigan food basket and should be recognized as part of agriculture. Our members urge the regulatory agencies, along with the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, state universities, and the aquaculture industry to continue working cooperatively to address the regulatory needs of the state while at the same time facilitating the continued growth of aquaculture in Michigan through streamlining aquaculture regulation and facilitating access to capital development. Our members support Michigan Farm Bureau being involved in the Michigan Aquaculture Association's strategic plan for development, and our members support development of open water cage culture of fish in the Great Lakes. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Gavin McClintock.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having all of us today. And, I've listened to everybody today, and I'm just here as a citizen. And I guess first and foremost, I want to make clear that I am very opposed to fish farming in the Great Lakes. And many gentlemen and women that are much more intelligent than me have put a lot of time and effort and their life into the research of the science and the law to back up why it doesn't work in the Great Lakes. Right now, my position is simple. I love to fish. I love the Great Lakes. I have a 6-year-old son that loves to fish, and I want to make sure that he grows up and experiences the opportunities that I've had, that my father shared with me. And I think organizations such as Trout Unlimited, the Charter Captains Association, the Salmon Steelheaders Association, there was a young lady, I don't remember all the associations and organizations that have spoken on behalf of that today, and there's certainly more, and I would just like to thank them for their hard work and their efforts. And I also would like to say that I'm here financially, physically, mentally, socially here to support all those organizations to make sure that fish farming does not happen in the Great Lakes. Thank you.
Thank you. Dave, do you have any other cards? That was the last of the cards of people who had registered ahead or turned in cards today, unless someone has one and hasn't provided it. Yes, sir. If you could come forward and state your name.
John Ernst, and I'm still a resident of Elmira Township. I guess there's been a lot of talk about the technical issues and the science, which I think are lead me to believe that this is something that a few people are willing to take a big risk with things that belong to the citizens of Michigan, with potential, a lot of financial gain for a few. But in basic principle, what we're talking about is establishing a concentrated feedlot where we need to use antibiotics because we're crowding in these animals so tightly. And we're going to do this on public lands, public property, and we're going to let everything just go into the lake. If we were talking about setting up a feedlot on state land where we were going to raise deer, and we were going to fence off a hunk of state land so that we could put up a feedlot for these animals, even if we could contain all of the waste, we wouldn't be here. The answer wouldn't be no, it'd be hell no. And I guess after listening to this today for 3 or 4 hours, I'm really confused about why we are even here. But thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you. With no other cards of people wishing to speak, the time is now 4:41. Again, thank you for your time and interest today. Copies of all the written comments and a summary of all the oral comments will be provided to the directors of the 3 departments and will be posted on the state's aquaculture website. We will continue to accept written comments until 5 p.m. on December 4th. If you need the email or US mail address to submit those, please see me or Hannah after the meeting. This concludes our meeting and we will adjourn. Thank you again.